I never loved you during these 50 years, the husband confessed to his wife right in the middle of the golden wedding anniversary dance. After those words, the wife took the microphone and revealed a secret she had kept silent for half a century. Her sister turned pale, and the guests were paralyzed from shock. The grand ballroom of the Seabreeze Hotel in San Diego shimmered under 1,000 tiny lights. A live jazz quartet played softly in the background as guests sipped champagne and whispered compliments about the stunning decor. White orchids suspended in tall glass vases, golden candles flickering across every table. The room was a portrait of elegance, warmth, and decades of shared memories. It was a night meant for celebration, not secrets. Margaret Dawson moved through the crowd like a seasoned host. Her silver hair was pulled into a soft bun, her pale blue dress cascading elegantly down to the floor. At 72, she had the grace of a woman who had lived through storms and still managed to arrive with her head high. She greeted every guest with sincerity, remembering names and childhood stories of people she hadn't seen in years. She had taught generations at the local high school, students who now stood before her with their own children in tow, still calling her Mrs. Dawson out of habit and respect. Richard, her husband, stood near the bar, shaking hands with old friends. At 75, his posture remained straight, his jaw tight, and his eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. A retired businessman who had built a modest fortune in real estate, he was known for being measured, formal, and dependable. He wasn't the type to smile often, but tonight he had worn a small one, forced and fleeting. No one seemed to notice. Their children, Thomas, Edward, and Lily, had organized the anniversary celebration. A slideshow of black and white wedding photos had just finished playing, ending with a recent picture of Margaret and Richard on their porch, holding hands with a golden retriever between them. Applause filled the room. Lily, the youngest, teared up as she thanked everyone for coming. Then came the moment everyone anticipated, the anniversary waltz. The music changed, and Margaret approached Richard with a soft nod. He offered his hand, and she took it, the room fading around them as the first notes of a slow waltz began. Guests stood aside to watch them, the couple who had made it through 5 decades, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and countless quiet dinners. For a few moments, it looked like love, or at least, it looked like something durable, worn in like a pair of shoes that had walked many miles together. Then, something shifted. Halfway through the song, Richard stopped. Just stopped. His hand fell from Margaret's waist. The music continued without them as confused glances spread across the room. Margaret looked up at him, surprised, her lips parted and asked a question, but he turned toward the DJ and signaled for a microphone. He took it slowly, his hand not trembling, but his eyes colder than they had been all evening. "I have something to say," he began, voice steady and calm. People smiled politely, expecting an emotional toast, maybe a tribute to Margaret's unwavering support or a funny story from their honeymoon. But his next words pulled the air straight out of the room. "I never loved you during these 50 years. The silence was total. A fork dropped somewhere in the distance. The jazz musicians stopped playing altogether. Margaret's eyes did not widen. She didn't blink. She simply stood there, holding his gaze, unmoving. "I'm sorry," Richard continued, though he didn't sound sorry. "It's not something I ever thought I'd say out loud. But tonight, with everyone here, it felt right. It felt honest." Gasps began to ripple through the crowd, confused murmurs overlapping with disbelief. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. Evelyn, Margaret's older sister, looked down at her glass of wine with a frozen expression. Lily moved closer to her mother, her instincts kicking in, but Margaret lifted her hand slightly, a silent signal. "Wait." Margaret looked at Richard as if trying to remember who he truly was underneath all those years. Then, very slowly, she turned toward the crowd, her chin lifted. I think I need to say something too, she said, her voice warm but strong. She extended her hand. Richard handed her the microphone without resistance. The room waited. No one moved. Margaret took a breath and looked around, meeting the eyes of old friends, family, and even the children who once sat in her classroom. She turned her head slowly toward Evelyn. Their eyes locked. During all these years, Margaret began, I've held on to something, and maybe this is the right moment to finally share it. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry. She simply looked at her sister and said, Richard never loved me because he was always in love with you, and I always knew. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was seismic, a collective stillness that pressed against the walls of the ballroom and made the chandeliers tremble. Evelyn's face drained of color. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough to be heard. Thomas stared, mouth open, frozen. Lily sat down, as if her knees had gone weak. Margaret kept her gaze fixed. And yet, I still married him. I still chose this life. I built this family. I danced this dance for 50 years, knowing the truth. She paused and then added, because I had my own secret too. And with that, she handed the microphone back and walked off the dance floor, leaving an entire lifetime behind her in stunned silence. The weight of Margaret's words had yet to settle when the sound technician, unsure what to do, slowly brought the music to a stop. The ballroom stood still, a picture frozen in time. Margaret had returned to her seat at the center table, her back straight, hands calmly folded on her lap, as if nothing more needed to be said. But the room had shifted. An emotional tremor was unfolding, quiet, then sharp, then overwhelming. Evelyn's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor, its crimson contents bleeding into the white tablecloth and marble. All heads turned toward her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished under the scrutiny of 100 pairs of eyes. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The woman who had always been the vibrant sister, the one with a laugh that filled rooms and eyes that once captivated every man she met, including, now it seemed, her sister's husband, could only stare in paralyzed disbelief. Thomas stood slowly, his broad shoulders tight with confusion. "What is going on?" he asked, voice low and sharp, directed at no one and everyone. He glanced between his mother and his aunt, then looked to Richard, who had returned to his seat and now sipped his water with deliberate detachment, as if the chaos around him was part of someone else's evening. Margaret rose again, not with drama or fury, but with the quiet control of a woman who had held her silence for too long and now had no intention of being interrupted. She faced her guests, who were still rooted in place, many of them unsure whether to sit, to leave, or to say something. Her voice remained even, but the meaning in her words cut deep. "I never needed this party," she said, "but my children insisted, and I agreed because I thought maybe this would be a night of peace, of closure. I was wrong." A middle-aged woman near the back, an old friend from Margaret's teaching days, reached for her husband's hand. No one else moved. Margaret continued, "Some of you may be wondering why I marry a man I knew didn't love me. It's a fair question. I asked myself the same thing every night for the first few years of our marriage. Then I stopped asking, because I realized I wasn't innocent either." Her eyes shifted toward Thomas, who was now standing beside Lily. Edward, who had said almost nothing the entire night, remained seated, pale and tense. Margaret's voice softened as she looked at her eldest son. "Thomas, there is something I never told you. Not because I didn't love you, but because I thought it would protect you. Now I see it only delayed what you had the right to know." Thomas stepped back slightly, a warning in his posture. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath. "You are not Richard's son." The words fell like a stone in water, rippling, crashing, pulling everything around it downward. Gasps echoed. Chairs scraped. Someone whispered a prayer. And Thomas, stunned, didn't move. His face didn't twist into confusion or anger. It simply collapsed into disbelief. "I don't understand," he said slowly, his voice hollow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Margaret answered gently, that before I married your father, I was involved with someone else, a man who meant something to me, briefly, and then he was gone. I never heard from him again. And when I found out I was pregnant, I was already engaged to Richard. Thomas shook his head, not out of denial, but in an attempt to process. You lied to me my entire life. Margaret nodded once. Yes, I did. I lied to protect you from the truth I wasn't brave enough to face. And because Richard never knew, I convinced myself it was better this way. Lily reached for her brother's arm, but he pulled away. So all this time, Dad wasn't even my father? Margaret didn't answer. Her silence was the answer. Edward finally spoke, his voice brittle. And you never told any of us? No, Margaret replied, because it was never about shame. It was about survival, about building a home in the ruins of something broken. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice weak but audible. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. Everyone turned again. I didn't ask him to love me, Evelyn continued, her hands trembling. I thought he loved her. I stayed away. I got married, moved to another city. I didn't know he never let go. Margaret gave her sister a long, unreadable look. You knew enough. You knew how he looked at you. You knew he wrote those letters. I never read them, Evelyn whispered. I burned the first one and ignored the rest. I found them, Margaret said, her tone unchanging. He kept them, hidden, but not too well. A waiter standing near the kitchen door slowly backed out of the room, realizing this was no longer a party. It was something else entirely. Thomas sat again, his body heavy. His mind was racing somewhere far away, perhaps decades back, through birthday parties and father-son fishing trips and college graduation speeches given by a man who, now, had never actually been his father. Lily leaned into Edward, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "What happens now?" No one had an answer. Margaret looked out at the guests once more, many of whom couldn't meet her gaze. Secrets don't stay buried. They just wait for the right night to surface. And then she sat down, and for the first time that evening, her hands shook as the guests began to quietly disperse. Murmuring apologies and awkward goodbyes, the ballroom thinned out, leaving behind only family and a few stragglers too stunned or polite to flee. The shattered mood hung like smoke, thick and unbreathable. The last song had long since ended. The lights had dimmed, and yet the Dawsons were still there, trapped not by the venue, but by everything that had just erupted after 5 decades of illusion. In the far corner, Evelyn sat alone, her hands cradling a napkin she had twisted into knots. She hadn't spoken again after her meek denial. Her presence now felt like a wound the family could not stop staring at, but no one dared confront her directly. Not yet. Thomas had taken refuge near one of the tall windows, his back turned to everyone, staring out at the quiet city below. He didn't move when Margaret approached. He had been still for almost 20 minutes, as if rooted to that spot by something heavier than betrayal. She stopped a few feet behind him, her voice soft. "I owe you more than what I said earlier." He didn't answer. He didn't even turn. She waited, letting the silence between them settle before continuing. "I met him when I was 23. His name was Daniel Everett. He was studying marine biology. We met through a mutual friend at a university seminar. He wasn't supposed to stay long, just a semester, but we were drawn to each other in that reckless way people are when they don't know how short everything really is." That name meant nothing to Thomas, and yet it landed in his chest like an anchor. "I wasn't in love," Margaret added. "Not the way I thought love should feel. But I felt something rare with him. Freedom, maybe. The sense that I was being seen fully for the first time." She paused, watching her son's shoulders rise and fall. "One night, he told me he was leaving early. A research vessel had accepted him onto their crew for a 6-month trip down the South Pacific. He kissed me goodbye. That was the last time I saw him." Finally, Thomas turned around. His expression was unreadable. "Did he ever know about me?" Margaret's face tensed. "No. I didn't even know myself until 2 months after he left. I wrote letters, sent them to his last known address. I even tried the university registrar, but he had disappeared. No family, no forwarding address. Nothing. She stepped closer, her voice beginning to tremble, though she tried to contain it. I told myself for years that I would find him, that I would tell him, even if he didn't want to be involved. But I met your father, and when he proposed, I saw a way to protect you. I saw structure, stability. It wasn't love, but it was something I thought I could grow into. Thomas's eyes narrowed. So you used him? I used myself, she replied without blinking. I gave up the idea of ever feeling anything real, because I thought I didn't deserve it anymore. He exhaled, folding his arms across his chest, guarding something deeper than pain. Why didn't you tell me once I was grown? After I got married, had kids of my own. Why not then? Because I thought the story ended. You had a father who loved you in his way, and I thought if I reopened that door, I might destroy what little piece we had built. He shook his head. It's not just a lie, Mom. It's the years of pretending. Every Christmas, every family dinner. You stood there and let me call him Dad like it meant something. It did mean something, she said, stepping forward, her voice firmer now. He raised you. He taught you to ride a bike. He never suspected, and yet he showed up year after year. I didn't take that from you. Thomas looked down, the words too heavy for response. Behind them, Lily and Edward stood uncertainly near the long buffet table, where uneaten slices of cake had begun to curl at the edges. They watched the exchange unfold with a mix of awe and discomfort. Edward finally broke the silence, addressing their mother from across the room. So what about us? Are you saying you only married him because of Thomas? Margaret turned, her eyes softening. At first, yes. I thought I was making a choice for one life. But then you and Lily came, and I stopped trying to rewrite the past. I embraced the life I had. Lily stepped forward, hesitant. Did Dad ever suspect? Ever ask questions? No, Margaret said, more to herself than anyone. He never looked closely enough. Or maybe he didn't want to. There were moments I thought he might know. But then he would retreat again into his office, his work, his silence. The word silence lingered in the air like a final judgment. In that moment, Evelyn stood. She looked at Margaret, her voice barely above a whisper. Was he still in love with me all these years? Margaret didn't flinch. You'd have to ask him that. I didn't ask him to love me, Evelyn said. I never responded. Not after you married. I know, Margaret replied. That's why I never hated you. But I couldn't forget either. I saw the way his eyes shifted when you entered a room. I heard the quiet in his voice when your name came up. And I knew, no matter what he said to me behind closed doors, his heart was always somewhere else. The tension snapped in that moment. Not into violence or shouting, but into a deeper stillness. The kind that follows realization, not revelation. The kind that rewrites the past without a single tear being shed. Margaret looked around at her children, at Evelyn, and finally back toward the door Richard had walked through an hour earlier. She didn't expect him to return. He had said what he came to say, and now she had too. I don't regret raising you, she said to her children, but I regret the silence, and I won't carry it anymore. She turned, walked toward the exit, and for the first time that night, no one tried to stop her. By the time the final guests had gone and the hotel staff began clearing away the remains of what was supposed to be a celebration, the Dawson family stood alone amid a graveyard of linen, half-eaten cake, and unanswered questions. The ambient music had been shut off. The chandeliers still glowed warmly above them, but the light no longer softened anything. It only exposed. Edward sat with his elbows resting on the banquet table, staring at nothing in particular. Lily paced. Thomas hadn't spoken again since his exchange with Margaret. He stood by the exit, jacket in hand, eyes vacant. Evelyn had left quietly not long after Margaret. No one had said goodbye. No one had asked her to stay. The air she left behind was thick with discomfort and unspoken accusations. It was Lily who finally shattered the silence. I don't even know what's real anymore. Edward glanced up, his voice low and dry. Well, I guess that makes three of us. She stopped pacing and turned toward him. Did you know something? Anything? You were always closer to Dad than the rest of us. No, he said, shaking his head. Not a clue. I thought their distance was just normal. They've been that way as long as I can remember. Thomas approached the table then, his footsteps heavy. It wasn't normal. We just didn't ask the right questions. You're blaming us now? Lily snapped, emotion bubbling up, for not noticing our entire childhood was a lie. I'm saying we accepted what was comfortable, Thomas replied. We lived in that house like everything was fine. But it wasn't, and now we know it wasn't just about them. Edward exhaled, leaning back. You know what hurts the most? It's not even about the affair. It's about the way it all got buried under routines, under holidays and small talk and family dinners, like we were extras in their lives. There was a beat of silence. Then Lily crossed her arms. So what do we do now? Just go back to our lives and pretend none of this happened? Mom blew up 50 years of silence in one night, and Dad just walks out like he's done with all of us. He didn't leave because of us, Thomas said coldly. He left because he didn't want to answer for anything. He never has. Edward frowned. You think he's just gone? For good. Thomas didn't answer. He walked over one of the tables and picked up a folded napkin, gripping it tightly in his hand before tossing it back down. I think he planned it. The speech, the timing, everything. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted to control the moment. Even now. That's not what I saw, Lily said, her voice quieting. He didn't look like he was in control. He looked tired, like someone who'd run out of ways to keep pretending. Thomas turned sharply. Pretending what? That he was a father? A husband? A man who spent 50 years holding a torch for the wrong woman and raising a child that wasn't his without asking a single question. Edward cut in, his voice calm but edged. You're not the only one who feels betrayed, Thomas. But you can't rewrite everything just to feed your anger. I'm not rewriting anything, Thomas snapped. I'm waking up to it. That's the difference. The three of them stood in a tight triangle of exhaustion, grief, and a slow disintegration of what once held them together. There had been no hugs after Margaret's confession, no efforts to find unity in the storm. Just three adult children trying to reconcile the version of their family they had been sold with the shattered truth laid bare before them. Lily finally broke away and retrieved her coat. I need to go home. I can't do this right now. Thomas didn't try to stop her. Edward simply nodded. I'll call you tomorrow, she added softly before stepping out of the ballroom and disappearing into the hallway. When it was just the two brothers, the silence between them grew heavier. Edward stood and straightened his tie, as if trying to regain some sense of order in a world that had spun off at axis. You gonna talk to her again? He asked. Thomas frowned. Who? Mom. Edward nodded. Thomas hesitated. I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. One moment I'm angry. The next I just want to understand her. But how do you understand a decision that big? A lie that long? Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it without urgency. You're not alone in this. Whatever happens next, we deal with it together, like brothers. Thomas gave a dry laugh. Yeah, but now I wonder if that word means what we thought it did. Edward met his eyes and said nothing, because there was no answer that could repair what had been broken, only time, if it chose to be generous. The following morning came with silence. Margaret returned to the house alone. Richard had not come back. His clothes were untouched. His books still sat on the shelf in alphabetical order, but his presence had vanished like breath on a cold mirror. There, then gone. She made coffee, not out of habit, but necessity. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the empty seat across from her. The only sound was the slow drip from the coffee maker and the faint rustle of trees outside the window. Her hands trembled as she reached for her notebook, a place she had always used for lesson plans and grocery lists, never for truth. But today, she needed to write. The first line came easily. Thomas, I owe you the whole story. As her pen moved across the page, Margaret Dawson began to shape the final confession. Not out of guilt, but out of something stronger, clarity. She had nothing left to hide, and no time to delay. What came next would not be about rebuilding what was lost, but about finally telling the truth before it was too late. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later. delivered not by Richard himself, but by a courier in a dark blue suit who avoided Margaret's eyes and handed her the manila envelope as if it might burn. She took it without a word and signed for delivery. When she closed the door, she stood in the entryway, staring at the envelope in her hands. Her fingers didn't tremble this time, not out of strength, but fatigue, a weariness that had finally settled now that the storm had passed, and all that remained were pieces to be swept away. She did not cry. She did not sit down immediately or tear the envelope open in a flurry of emotion. Instead, she walked to the dining room table, placed it gently on the polished wood surface, and turned to make tea. Not coffee. Not today. The bitterness of coffee no longer suited her. She needed something softer now, something that reminded her there was still sweetness to be found, even after everything had gone dry. When she finally returned and opened the envelope, she wasn't surprised by anything it contained. Richard's signature was clear and firm at the bottom of each document. There was no note, no personal message, no explanation, just the cold formality of dissolution, lines drawn through a shared life, columns dividing property, assets, years. She had half expected that. Richard had always been a man who saw emotion as an obstacle to efficiency. He would never have offered a farewell in words, only through paperwork. But she did notice the return address on the law firm's letterhead. It wasn't San Diego. It was Santa Barbara. He had moved quickly, it seemed. Perhaps he had been planning this even before that night. Or maybe the collapse of everything had propelled him into action he'd been too cowardly to take for decades. Either way, it was over. The next day, Evelyn left town. No one said goodbye, not even a phone call. She disappeared as quietly as she had entered, leaving behind only silence and a hollow place in the family structure where the favorite aunt had once existed. Lily received a brief email. "I'm sorry. Please take care of your mother." There was no return address. Thomas didn't speak to Margaret for nearly a week. But on the seventh day, a letter arrived, folded neatly inside a white envelope hand-addressed, and resting on the doormat like something sacred. Margaret read it alone in the living room, the light soft and golden through the window blinds. "I'm not ready to forgive," the letter began, "but I want to understand." Those words meant more to her than any apology could have. It was a door, not wide open, but ajar, enough for her to know she hadn't lost him forever. She wrote back that same night. 3 pages, handwritten, no edits. She told him about her fears, about the days she almost ran away, about the moment she looked at him as a child and felt both wonder and guilt in equal measure. She didn't ask for his forgiveness. She didn't try to rewrite the past. She only offered the truth, piece by piece, the way one might place stones along a path to find their way home. Lily visited a few days later. She brought groceries, as if Margaret had suddenly become incapable of navigating the world on her own. Margaret accepted the gesture, not because she needed the food, but because she understood what it really meant. Lily was afraid that everything fragile in their lives might still shatter further. In the kitchen, Lily unpacked items in silence until finally she said, "Dad isn't answering my calls." Margaret nodded. "He won't. Not for a while. Do you think he'll ever talk to us again?" "I think," Margaret said gently, "he's trying to forget who he was here, and that means forgetting us too." Lily looked down, her hand still. "You're really not angry at him?" "I was, for a long time. But anger eats everything eventually. I held on to enough of it in silence to know it doesn't solve anything. Not now." Edward, ever the quiet observer, called later that week. They talked about mundane things, the garden, the news, the price of gas. But near the end of the call, he hesitated and then asked, "Do you feel free now?" Margaret took a long breath before answering. "No, but I feel honest, and maybe that's better." Life resumed, but not in the way people hope after tragedy. There were no second honeymoons, no family reunions to reclaim lost time. Instead, there was a slow, daily reckoning. Margaret found herself speaking more often with her neighbors, sitting outside on her porch in the early morning light, sipping tea and watching the world without the weight of pretense. People whispered, of course. The story had spread. How could it not? But no one said anything cruel to her face. If anything, they admired her, not for the scandal, but for surviving it. At the local library, where Margaret volunteered on Tuesdays, an old friend pulled her aside and whispered, "You did something brave." Margaret only smiled, because bravery had nothing to do with it. She had waited too long. Bravery would have been telling the truth decades ago. What she did now was simply necessary. Thomas eventually visited, not with the entire family, not with forgiveness, but alone. He brought a photo album from his childhood and placed it between them like a question neither of them knew how to answer. They sat for an hour flipping to the pages, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. At one photo, a picture of him at age 6, sitting on Richard's shoulders at the beach, he asked, "Did you ever think about telling him? The truth, I mean." Margaret stared at the photo for a long time before replying. Every day, and every day, I told myself it was too late. Until it wasn't. He nodded. "I think I would have wanted to know. Even then." "I know that now," she said. "But I didn't know who I was back then. I was afraid of losing everything before I even had anything." They sat in that moment, surrounded by silent years finally breaking apart into honesty. The pain didn't fade, but it changed shape. It no longer held them hostage. When Thomas left that afternoon, he hugged her. Not tightly, not fully, but it was the first gesture of closeness since the night of the party. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself feel it, however brief. In the evenings, she began dancing again, alone, in the living room, barefoot on the wooden floor. She played old records, songs from her youth, ones she had once avoided because they reminded her of too much. Now, they reminded her of freedom, of time unburdened, of movement without permission. She danced not for anyone watching, but because it felt like breathing again after years beneath the surface.